everyone. Um, Bob and Chad, RTI Speed Tips with Bob and Chad, episode number 49. Um, been a lot of episodes, and we sure appreciate you guys all coming on and listening and being with us for this time. And I know this is the time of the year where there's so much stuff going on with Christmas and everything that people have a tendency to be busy. Um, I know we've been pretty darn busy here in the shop. And I wasn't here today. I came in and there was another car that showed up over the day, and I'm thinking, we just don't have the room for all of this. We're going to have to get some of this stuff gone here pretty soon. So, how about you, Chad? What's new and exciting with Chad?
Oh, we've been pretty busy. We had the St. Louis race there a couple weeks ago. Went and did that and had a good time there. And that's always a fun event, and it's a great place for us to test the strength of our parts because it's generally not the smoothest surface. So that went pretty good. We're busy here. We're finishing up the catalog and getting ready to get that in the mail and get the new year rolling.
Awesome. So, how was the show there at St. Louis?
St. Louis was good. It was a great turnout. I'd say they had, I don't know, there must have been 18,000 fans there. I mean, anytime you can race cars inside of basically a stadium like that, it's such an awesome atmosphere, and it just makes your hair stand up. It's just a huge marquee event, and how they do the intros and play it up, and they really do a good job promoting it. But it was a really good event. We got out and got to see a bunch of our people and helped them, and it's an awesome time.
Sure. Well, it's pretty cool to see Tyler Peterson win that modified show. That was pretty exciting.
Yeah, we did a clean sweep. So he runs all our suspension, and then Tyler Carpenter also runs all our suspension on the late model. So we were pretty happy with the turnout there, and yeah, they had all three, right? They had all three national champions.
Yeah.
The modified race up front was the won by the Wissota national champion, and then the IMCA national champion Bone Larson, and then the UMP national champion Nick Hoffman. They were all up there battling. So I mean, it don't get any more even than taking them guys and putting them in that stadium atmosphere on a track that they don't run very often. And it was really, the mod race was the best one. It was really it was a hell of a show for sure.
Good. Well, that sounds pretty cool. Well, and we're just busy getting ready for the schools. Of course, we've got our first school is January 14th and 15th for the two-link school. Then February 4th and 5th, of course, is the four-link school. And Stock Car School is the 25th and 26th. And then, of course, our New York school, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio school is March 4th and 5th. And we've got, yeah, Rocky says, I haven't seen you in like a week, believe me. I almost canceled this at 6 o'clock tonight. I wasn't feeling super duper great. And then I thought, well, I can tough it out for an hour. So I haven't seen my old buddy Chad for over a month. And so I figured I could get through it. I got my water so my throat doesn't dry out and I'll be fine. Sometimes you just gotta suck it up.
Tough it out.
There you go, tough it out. The RTI schools, all the chassis schools will be broadcast. Well, no, the first three schools will be broadcast and live on IMCA TV. And of course, now if you're getting anybody for Christmas, keep in mind it's a good idea to orders need to be placed before Thursday to make sure that we get you the stuff in time for Christmas. We got our new hats. Finally got some new hats, and they're actually pretty comfortable. I've been pretty impressed with this hat. I'm kind of a picky hat person, so I don't always do quite so Sad day today, but I'm watching. Good to have you guys. Why is it a sad day today, Pat? Is there something I don't know about? Um, but anyway, so that's kind of what the agenda has been. Agenda for tonight, I wanted to kind of just retouch on some of that off-season maintenance stuff. We didn't have, or I kind of rushed through it the last time we were on here, and I think it's just very important to um, talk about that stuff because there's so much stuff. Now you have the time to do all that stuff, and it just, it just makes sense to just get everything. Oh, sorry to hear about that, Pat. But anyway, so just kind of has a thing to do list. First thing I got on my list, of course, is the chassis stuff. Make sure you inspect the frame, go through everything, make sure you replace all the bent parts and stuff on it. Refer to your preseason maintenance or your pre-season measurements that you took at the beginning of the year and make sure that there's no bends or nothing, that the stub is not wrong or the tail section is not bent over or whatever. The other thing is make sure and check for all the welds. I mean, these cars are built today to flex, and the majority of the racetracks are pretty good tracks. But then there's it seems like there's still that time where some of those racetracks can be pretty marginal and they can take a little bit of wear and tear on the car. And like I said, these cars are built to have a certain amount of flex in them, so make sure you check for the welds and on the cracks in the cage in the center, especially down around the X. Motor mounts, that's another one that there's enough torque and stuff. Those motor mounts kind of get cracked and bent and yeah, Jamie says he checked his car over. He had 7 cracked welds, and that's just not uncommon. I mean, it's Panhard bar mount. That's another thing that takes a lot of abuse. Fuel cell brackets, and the pull bar mount. Chad was just telling me about a customer that's what happened to them at St. Louis. Pull bar mount came out of the car. So anyway, needless to say, those are the type of things that are very important. Suspension, check over all your spindles. Make sure you don't have a bent spindle or whatever. Go through the ball joints. Make sure that those are all in good shape. Look through your control arms. Heim joints are another thing. Most of the time, it's about time just to replace all that stuff. But some of the stuff can still be good, and you can get some life out of it. Tie rods, center link. Tie rods, center link. Check your sliders over. Same thing with that. Make sure there's no nicks and stuff in the shaft, and if there's nothing that's bent or that's binding there, rebuild your sliders. They all need to have, you need to have everything fresh and ready to go at the beginning of the year. Check your springs to make sure there's no springs that are bowed. Some of the long, real light springs can be, end up getting a bow in them because we're making them do stuff that they weren't really designed to do. And so replace them. I recommend replacing the springs every season. In fact, actually more often than that. In my opinion, a right front spring was 15-night spring almost. With the amount of abuse that the springs are, and we're running a lot softer springs, and we're loading them more, and so that's an issue. Rear ends. Carefully inspect the rear end, especially if you've got a 9-inch Ford rear end. Measure to make sure you don't have any bent axle tubes. One of the biggest misconceptions that people think, well, my axles slide in and out, so my rear end can't be bent. Well, there's enough play and there's enough tolerance in with the axles and that spool and everything that I've had guys with a rear end that's bent 3/8 of an inch and the axle slid in and out just as if it wasn't bent, but you could physically see that it was bent. So, make sure you double check all that stuff, go through that so that what you got. Make sure there's nothing there, because there's nothing worse than fighting a handling issue with a bent axle tube. Check the drive flange for wear. And go through that stuff. Make sure that if you did have a bent axle tube, make sure that they're not wore too much, so that you could end up with a problem, shearing the splines off of an axle tube. Chad, did you want to comment on that one?
The Joey that bought a clamp-on pull bar mount?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there was no issues with the clamp-on pull bar mount. It actually ripped the tube out of the chassis, so that's where he was talking about cracked welds and stuff. And that, I mean, I don't know if you watched St. Louis or have you been to St. Louis, but it's like the Baja 5000, so it definitely tests the frame wall thicknesses and the parts, and it wasn't a part failure, but it ripped the tube out of the car.
Yeah, I can see that being a possibility. Shock absorbers, make sure you carefully inspect the shock absorbers. Look for the dents in the bodies. Make sure you compress the shock in and out, so that that if there's a dent, that if that dent is too deep and it's affecting the piston and the wear band. Also check the heim joints for movements. It's recommended, in my opinion, every off season you need to have your shocks rebuilt and gone through, and just get everything up to snuff, so that you know what actually is what you have before you start the season. There's no reason to start the season with an issue that you're going to fight and you're going to try to figure out later, because of course you want to start off the season in a good note. Take a small brush with soapy water and clean all the grease and stuff out of them during the off season. Like I said, after you do get them rebuilt and you take them home, make sure you store them in a temperature controlled environment. That's definitely a good idea. Shock question. Bob, is it normal for a shock with a Schrader valve to bleed off gas nightly? No, that's not normal. There's evidently a leak somewhere. I would almost be willing to bet that there's something's faulty with the Schrader valve itself, and that's something that you yourself could easily replace and put back in there, or put it in there. That wouldn't be a big deal for you to do that. Just make sure when you do it that the shock is fully extended, and then take that port out and put a new one in. Whoever your shock builders is, just have him send you a new one, and that's something you could probably do yourself easily. My electric hobby stock car has a stock upper A-frame mount from the factory, so you can't mess with the mounts. What angle degrees would you suggest the left front upper and right front upper be set at ride height with the lower control arms level? Well, the biggest thing you're going to want to do is, we tend to run a little bit more angle in the left. Well, actually, we run a little bit more angle in the left front. With what you're doing, I can't actually give you an exact angle number. Off the top of my head, seems to me like somewhere around 15 to 18 degrees on the left upper, and around 12 to 15 on the right upper. Our products, what we do is our upper ball joints, and I don't know if your rules allow you can run different ball joints, but if you can run different ball joints, we use a plus half on the left front, and then a standard length ball joint on the right front. Where's a good place to shoot from having a roll center on a big half mile? If you're going to go through the whole roll center deal, as a general rule of thumb, 4 inches is a pretty good. That works in most everything. You get a little higher than that, then you're going to have to start running a lot softer springs, and that might create more issues than what you want, but 4 inches is pretty good. Um, and if you can run it 4 inches, I like to see it to the point where it's pretty close to center. We do run it to the left a little bit, but close to the center would be good. What would you recommend for Heim lube with your lube joints? Um, Anything but WD-40. That's the worst product you could put on a Heim joint. It'll actually wear the Heim joint out more. We run just a synthetic grease that we spray on there. That's in fact, I can't even think of the name of it. I apologize. I'm not thinking clearly. It's the same grease that we used to use back in the old days when we had the go-karts. Triflow. It's a product called Triflow, and that's worked pretty good. What does moving the pull bar up or down on the rear end do for you? Also, what benefit does it have being lower on the rear end than higher? Also, what does it do moving it further back on the rear end? Well, it kind of depends on the pull bar you're running, but as a normal rule of thumb, we end up with that thing about center of axle housing to the top of the rule of thumb seems to be around 11 inches. If you run it a little lower, it definitely creates more traction, but you have to be a lot stiffer. And Garrett, I lost Chad. And being also the benefit of having it higher on the rear end, you wouldn't definitely want to have it any higher on the rear end. What happens is you get more movement, and then when you start getting more movement, all of a sudden you're getting it's not lifting the car. You have to go softer on the pull bar to get the pull bar to move. The further away from the rear end you get, and then what happens is now all of a sudden you're compressing the spring, and you're actually just compressing the spring and not transferring the load to the rear end. The biggest change in moving it back on the rear end, some guys like that a little better. When we moved it originally back years ago, when we moved it ahead, we were getting so much pull bar movement. Well, now we've kind of restricted that pull bar movement to the point where we're only getting 1.25 inches of pull bar movement. And so now we're going back to center of the rear end. When you go behind the rear end, when the car pulls and the car torques itself up, the pull bar will actually lose angle. Now, granted, it's not going to lose angle in perspective, because when you're all hiked up on the left rear, you've got quite a bit of angle anyway. But when you pull back on it and it starts to pull down, then you're not gaining as much angle as you would if it was ahead of the center. Biggest thing, the pull bar, in my opinion, one of the biggest benefits is moving it left to right. You can take that thing from the center and move it 1 inch to the right, and it definitely helps traction the right rear up. Keep in mind, whichever direction you move that's the tire you're going to try to influence, and that's going to actually work really well.
Chad's power's out.
Okay. Can you spend some time explaining the bar toe on a 4-link modified? Well, the thing that you want to do if you're checking your car out is go through and put it in dynamic mode. What you want to do is you want to get it to the point where when the car goes in dynamic mode, that your bars end up being relatively straight. What will happen is in the right rear is the lower right rear is the one that we actually end up angling it slightly outward, because when it rolls over, the rear end, the frame actually kind of moves to the left of that, and so then that actually ends up putting more angle in it. But the biggest thing is, like I said, run that through your dynamics, and the objective is when the car is in dynamic mode where you're all hiked up and it's full load, you want those bars moving as straight as they possibly can. And that's my opinion. On a quick change, back that down. Oh, there we go. Derek, on a quick change, yeah. Nope, I agree with that. I understand. That's kind of what I thought when you were talking about that, Derek. On a big half-mile track, if wedge is the same, would you prefer a 16-inch heavier or softer 20-inch spring? Also, is a shorter or longer wheelbase car beneficial on a big racetrack? Well, in reality, probably on a real big sweeping corner racetrack, more than likely you're gonna like the longer wheelbase car. It's probably gonna be a little smoother to drive, but I don't know if I would build a specific car for a specific racetrack. The trend now is to go the shorter wheelbase, the 108 or whatever your rules are. The 16-inch spring, the problem you run into with that 20-inch spring is to get that thing in the car, you have to go pretty soft, and then you end up getting a lot of spring bow in it. And what happens is when you get the taller, lightweight spring, you're actually loading the spring, but keep in mind you're compressing that spring a whole lot more to the point where your car is going to get more hike right on the throttle, but the actual load itself, it's still, like say a 20-inch spring that's a 100-pound spring, it's still 100 pounds per inch. So you're going to compress it 6 inches, so you might have 600 pounds of load on that actual spring, but you're not going to have the same amount of load as you would on a heavier spring. But that being said, a lot of guys like the taller spring. I've kind of always stayed with the 16-inch spring. I think that works pretty well. And you can still go fairly soft with a 16-inch spring and put more load in it. Is the sport mod pull bar on the rear end adjustments the same theory with a solid rod? In reality, yes, it is to an extent. You don't get as much movement because of the solid rod. However, the biggest thing to keep in mind is when the car, you're still getting a lot of roll steer in the car, so the rear end actually is moving around quite a bit. And so even with it being a solid arm, you're still getting quite a bit of movement with that solid arm. So everything pretty much stays the same as you would if you had a pull bar. I would mount everything the same exact location as I would with a pull bar car. LED placement on an IMCA modified, where and where not to have it. Well, I'm not a real big believer on an IMCA car having weight too far back. I prefer to make sure my weight is in front of the fuel cell. If I have to add a lot of weight, I still go off of the polar moment, which the short story of the polar moment is basically the center of the car, where if you could find that specific spot and jack the car up, the car would tilt and rotate evenly on both sides. As a rule of thumb, that's kind of by the driver's elbow, across from his rib cage, in that neighborhood there. So that's where I actually put the majority of my weight to add weight to the car. Now, if I need to add left side weight or if I need to add rear weight, I would move the weight either to the left or to the rear. But still, I wouldn't go behind. I wouldn't go any further than behind the front of the fuel cell. You get too far back, what happens is that's the car that's going to give you a push in the middle of the corner because the weight's so far back that it's trying to take load off the right front, and the car is just not going to be very balanced. 2015 GRT IMCA modified, 3/8 mile 3/8 mile bank fast racetrack, went to zero index, and locked the left rear brake to the cage. I couldn't keep the cross member out of the dirt, and sometimes picked up such a bad throttle push that what could I change to make that setup work better? Well, not knowing, Brenton, not knowing everything that I would need to know to completely answer that question, more than likely, you might want to go back to putting the floater, the brake floater back on, unhooking that, because of course, it's the car's going to try to load that left rear quite a bit. Chad's lost power, so he's not here with us because he would be a good one to ask about that. If he comes back on, we'll come back to this question. But in my opinion, not knowing more about it, it'd be hard for me to. The throttle push, of course, is that it's just hooking the left rear up so much, and you might need to back off your left rear percentage, the bite in the car. Depending on the springs, you might need to stiffen your right rear spring. A lot of times that's pretty common to have to do. And the other thing is if the car's, depending on how the car gets into the corner, you might consider even stiffening your left front spring. That will help hold the car up a little bit more getting in. Jess, what is your opinion of the left rear coilover behind the axle on IMCA modified? Well, I think it's a good idea. I mean, we always run our left rear, or you mean having the coilover with the shock and everything behind. The problem I don't know, the problem with that setup is without having that shock in front, the car can get a little bit skittish getting in, and it's not always as consistent. A lot of guys that run that, it gives you more straight line traction with the shock and the spring all on the behind the housing, but it just doesn't seem like it affects the corner entry too much. And I think what you gain by traction off the corner, I think you lose a little bit on corner entry. So I'm not sure you gain your overall lap time. I'm not sure is any better. Would you explain the left front chain limiter? The left front chain limiter, what that basically does, of course, is it does exactly what it says. It limits the travel of the left front. Why would we want to do that? Well, by limiting the travel of the left front, it helps the car. You get into the corner and you go to throttle it up, and then the car kind of rolls to the right rear. And with limiting the travel on the left front, what it does is it doesn't let the car roll to the left rear, to the right rear as much. I'm sorry, it rolls to the right rear. It eliminates some of that roll to the right rear, and so when the car goes in and it starts to roll to the right rear, then all of a sudden it stops. Then that weight transfers it to the left rear, so it gains left rear traction on when you're on the throttle. Now, sometimes in certain conditions, you do have to run a little bit more chain drop on racetracks that are a little heavier and you're going to take a little bit more load on the right rear tire. But as a rule of thumb, limiting the chain on the left front will give you more traction. And from the center of the corner off, it seems to give the car more traction. What's your thoughts on that Swift tight wound spring with a stock car? To be honest with you, I don't have a lot of experience with that. I know there's a lot of guys that like that. I don't know if that spring's actually going to be. I had heard some talk that spring might not be legal this year, so I don't. You want to check that out. I know the stock car rules are out, but check that out. We got Chad back.
Just click show and stream.
There we go. There's Chad.
Well, that was exciting.
Yeah. Let's go back to that one question.
What did I miss?
A lot of good questions. Okay. Brandon's got a question. He's got a 2015 GRT modified 3/8 mile high bank half fast racetrack. Went to zero indexing and locked up the left rear brake to the cage and couldn't keep the cross member out of the ground, out of the dirt. And sometimes picked up a bad throttle push. What could he change to work with that setup?
Yeah, that's the problem when you hook that brake to the cage, especially on a fast high bank track, and it's going to put it on the right front harder and faster than a brake floater would. You might not be able to lock it to the cage there. If you can't get it off the right front, if you put 50 pounds of spring in the right front, it might not work at that track. The brake on the cage isn't perfect everywhere. So I would probably go away from it. If it's fast, high banked, and it's on the right front, that's the problem. So go back to the brake floater arm and tune the angle of the arm to fit the racetrack.
Well, that's good. That was kind of my suggestion. So
I'd stay on the zero index. Zero index don't have nothing to do with that.
Yeah, the zero index doesn't have anything to do with it. Okay, Paul, I'm using the DRP spacers on all four corners. Having trouble with them loosening up and losing their set height, allowing slop in the bearings. Have tried Loctite with the set screw and whatnot, and still having trouble, especially with the right rear. The rear spacers are so thin, it's tough to get that set screw to hold with them. Any suggestions? Boy, I don't. You got any suggestions on that one?
I thought that set screw would hold. I mean, I never had any issues. I don't know. The set screw should hold it. It wrecks the threads pretty much, right?
Yeah.
Or is there a groove for it now? I know
I think there's a groove for it now.
When they first made them, they wrecked the threads, and you pretty much, it was welded right there, basically. But
boy, I'm
red Loctite and that set screw should be golden.
Yeah, but Paul, that's kind of what I would say. I don't know what else to tell you because I haven't. Make sure that you're not setting them. Well, of course, if you set it up without, if you set it up and it ends up being too loose to begin with, that's going to cause the problem, or going to cause part of the problem if you don't have a certain amount of preload on it. Because if it's a little bit free in there, that's going to allow that to work freely and not do what it's supposed to do. So I would probably try your initial preload maybe just a little bit higher would be the only suggestion that I would have. What does adjustments on the chains on either side of the rear end do on an IMCA Sport Mod? Well, yeah, Casey, you have a great Christmas too. Well, we're getting that Christmas is coming, man. It's not going to be long, and Santa's going to be here, man. Garrett wanted me to bring my Santa hat, but I forgot it. But anyway, what the chains do let's just start with the right rear. Legally, you can't have any load on the right rear spring, or actually right rear chain. It has to be free to the touch. But I would have it so that it's just free to the touch. What I've always done is make sure that I have the chain to the point where the spring, I don't want the spring sloppy in there. I want the spring to have a little bit of load on it so that it doesn't get free in there and unload the spring. The left rear, what the chain does is that pretty much eliminates that does your drop. That gives you the point where you kind of regulate how much left rear drop you have in the car, how much left rear angle you get in your lower control arm, because you know if you lengthen the chain, you're going to get a lot more movement. Problem with that is sometimes you get movement, then you don't get action. So it's kind of a tuning device. You know, you can try it different ways. I always run a certain amount of load on it. I can actually tell you how much actual load, but I think we set ours at the length is like 4 3/4 or 4.5 inches, something to that effect. But that doesn't mean anything to you because we're using a frame measurement. You know, we're not knowing for sure what your frame is. What would you recommend, Chad?
Pretty good starting point, I would say.
Bryce, hey guys, missed the beginning. Gonna have to go back and see if there's any announcements about the jet deal. My question is having seen some people running the right rear shock behind the axle, any particular benefits? Well, I just almost hate to say that the benefit's going to be is you're going to get a lot more straight line traction. The problem with that is when you go behind the housing, you got to understand how the rear end wraps and unwraps and how it loads and unloads. With it being in front of the housing, when the car unloads, it actually loads and keeps a certain amount of spring pressure. The car comes down, loads the spring, and the axle housing comes up and it loads the spring. With it being behind the housing, you've got the weight of the car coming down and loading the spring, but then the axle wrap unloads the spring. So it can be a little sensitive in the middle of the corner to the point where it might get a little throttle tight in the middle of the corner. We ran that years ago on the modifieds, the right rear spring behind the housing all the time. And it definitely has good forward bite. It's definitely got good side bite getting in. Can be a little sketchy in the middle of the corner. It just all depends on your horsepower. High horsepower motor probably is not a bad idea. A crate motor, I wouldn't recommend it because I think you're going to have some mid-corner issues. The car is going to be a little throttle tight in the middle of the corner. What's the advantage or disadvantage of running a pull bar versus a solid upper link in its place on an IMCA modified? Well, the solid upper link, people will tell you there's nothing that has more traction than a solid link. However, the problem with that is with the tires that we run, and it doesn't matter, we've got an 8-inch tire, and it doesn't matter if it's an American Racer or if it's a Hoosier or a UMP tire or a Wasota tire, we still have a fairly narrow tire. So when it gets real slick, the car actually has to have a little bit of movement to get the action started, so that we have a little more horsepower with an IMCA modified than we do a sport mod. So it's going to try to shock the tires with that solid upper link. So the pull bar eliminates or minimizes that tire shock and allows the car to start its traction, and then the pull bar goes to work to continue the traction. What's the advantage of using the Torrington bearing on the springs? Does the spring cup swivel? Does the spring cup not swivel in the same way? Well, I'll let Chad answer that one, but they don't do the same exact thing.
I just got good news from manufacturing. We didn't wreck anything in the power outage.
Awesome.
So anytime there's CNC machines running and the power goes out and they stop dead in their tracks, generally you wreck a lot of stuff, but we're all good.
That's not good.
Torrington bearing, sorry, where were we?
Let's see, Steve here what's the advantage of using the Torrington bearing on the springs? Does the spring cup not swivel in the same way?
So yeah, so this is the bearing that's in the spring cup, okay? Moves really nice and easy. When you put that 1,000 pounds of load on that really tiny surface area, it's not going to move anymore. So this is basically just for your angular alignment to get your screw jack lined up is all that guy's for. The Torrington bearing then goes in there underneath there and allows for that thing to when it's traveling then let the spring twist like it would normally, when the spring is moving, it winds itself and unwinds itself. So that just basically lets it relax so it doesn't have that extra friction or bind basically when it's going through travel. So it actually, I think it allows the rate to be softer, wouldn't you say, Bob? The spring acts soft.
I would agree with that because what it does is it takes a little bit of the spring bind out of it and allows the spring to work more naturally without having to bind against the cup. And so I think it actually softens the spring rate just a little bit as far as how it actually, it doesn't soften the spring, but it gives you that appearance that it softens the spring because it's allowing it to move freer. And in my opinion, there's a huge difference. You can tell when Chad first got them and we got some to try, I felt that made quite a bit of difference in making the front end freer, getting into the corner, and it just seemed like the spring was doing its job smoother. Okay, let's see here. What's the effect or advantage would raising the upper A-frame mounts, Chevelle modified, having besides roll center and instant center? Jared, that's the only thing that you're just changing the arc of your A-frame, but you're moving the roll center and the instant center quite a bit. So it wouldn't really have an advantage other than relocating the roll center. You could do the same thing with different length ball joints rather than moving the center. The advantage, of course, of doing it with a ball joint is you find out you don't like what it did, you can sure go back pretty easily. Hey guys, on the IMCA stock car, what is the benefit of running a softer left rear spring, and is there a point where it's too soft and will not work? Well, the benefit, of course, with that spring, running a softer spring, you can put more preload in it, which when you put more load on the spring, and we kind of talked about this just a little bit ago, the soft spring will just compress more, which when you compress it more, you're going to have more stored energy. So it's going to try to let the car hike up more when you get back on the throttle. And the biggest thing is with a stiffer spring, we can get load on there, but it doesn't seem like we can get as much movement as we can with that softer spring. Now, there is a point where I believe that a guy can go too soft. In my opinion, on a stock car, I wouldn't probably venture any softer than a 125 or a 150. I know there's some guys that are going a lot softer than that, but you're also putting a lot of stress and strain on a spring that's trying to carry a lot of weight, and it's not designed to do that. So I think there's going to be some inconsistencies there. If you go softer on the left rear, you're probably going to need to go stiffer on the right rear, and more than likely you're going to want to go stiffer on the left front. I run an 1,100-pound right front and a 900-pound left front, 16 in the left rear 150 and a 13 225. I feel like I suck in the black slick as far as being in the racetrack. What are some things spring-wise would you recommend to gain more traction in the corners, stock car, street stock? The trend seems to be flipping that around and actually running that 900 in the right front and that 1100 in the left front. When you go softer on that left rear spring, it's just a rule of thumb that you're almost going to have to go stiffer on that left front. The car still has to have X amount of spring in it to make the car work. So when you do go softer with one corner, it's pretty common to have to go stiffer, and the left side springs kind of go together and the right side springs kind of go together. But as a rule of thumb, that's one of the things that the trend is a little bit more left rear bite and running that stiffer left front. That's going to make the car tighter getting into the corner. It's going to give you more side bite. And I think when you find that you get more side bite getting into the corner, the car is going to have enough load, and it's going to try to work itself so that it's got more corner speed. And with more corner speed, you're going to have more traction off the corner just because you're actually going faster. Chad, have you ever considered going into the spring business?
No, there's no colors left in the rainbow.
True.
There's yellow springs, blue springs, purple springs, black springs. There's no room for me. So no, I'm not going to make springs. I can't afford to get into that market. There's too many good springs out there right now.
I mean, there's a lot of good quality stuff out there. There's no doubt about it. Still wish somebody would make a 12-inch spring for my right rear as my motto of sport mods, but oh well.
You know people.
Yeah, I've told people, believe me. I need more people to tell people. Meant just the shock, sir, but running the spring on the slider. Oh, yeah. Well, I'd recommend Bryson going back to, let's go back to Bryce's original question. Yeah, not doing the not doing the shock. I mean, if you just did the shock on the right rear, that's definitely not a bad idea. You're still going to have, there's a potential for it to be a little bit tighter, but the big advantage that you can do there is it's a lot easier to change shocks. Say your base shock is a 4-valve shock and your dry slick shock is a 3-5 or something like that. It's a lot easier to change the shocks. But with the shock behind the housing on the right rear, I think that's a definite good idea. In your opinion, what are the benefits and disadvantages of running a setup with the right front tethered and chained? Well, if your rules allow you to do that, I think there's huge benefits to that. If we could run a chain on that right front where we could put preload in that spring, that would be a huge advantage. So in my opinion, it would definitely, by loading that spring, you're putting more traction in the car, you're putting more load on that right front spring, but you're controlling the load. Where with our rules, we've got to be able to have the shock so that there's no load on the shock, because originally we were doing it by using the length of the shock absorber, adjusting that shock absorber so that we had load on it, and that just makes the car crisper, responds better. I think it's just a whole better deal in my opinion. So if I could run that, I definitely would. On a metric clip car, is it preferred to run the stock center link or the Camaro AFCO improved geometry setup before I buy a handful of parts and checking the bump steer to check on them? Well, Dan, I've not really experimented with that because, of course, our rules don't allow us to do that. from what I have read about the deal and what people have told me, is it definitely helps the bump steer with that different length. But I wouldn't. I couldn't actually answer that question, to be honest with you. I just don't have any experience with it. Hi, Tim. Merry Christmas to you guys, too. We appreciate that. Merry Christmas from everybody at Schaefer Oil. Chad, what if your spring cup rubs on the frame? Will it add a bind?
Yeah, you don't want the spring cups to rub the frame. If the spring cups are rubbing the frame, you need to clearance the frame more, or I don't know, possibly the screw jack isn't lined up properly, or something's definitely wrong there. So I would clearance that so it doesn't rub.
Yeah, more than likely the spring weight jack cup is not in the frame at the right angle. How we actually do that with ours is we have a jig that's actually a spring with the lower control arm, that we put the control arm and compress the spring in there, and then weld the nut in there like that, so that that spring and jack cup are perfectly in line. And that's a huge deal, because all of a sudden now everything is running in line, where before you could have your spring cup all tipped to one side or the other and binding on the frame. So clearancing the frame would definitely be a good idea, but I would make sure, and I'd still look at it to make sure it's centered like it's supposed to be. What are your thoughts on running the left rear lower bar at the center of the birdcage, center pull, on a 4-bar A modified? Does it allow the car to settle quicker in tech? Along that line, does running the left rear behind shock mount being closer to the axle housing or axle center versus full drop allow the deck to settle quicker, or do you give up a grip to the slower shock action? I'll let you answer the first part of that question.
Well, we made plates to move that lower 4-link rod up on the center line probably 5 or 6 years ago, and it made the car so free and so erratic that it really we didn't find anything, so we went away from it pretty quickly.
Along that line, does running the left rear behind the shock mount being closer to the axle housing center, full drop, allow the deck to settle? I don't see where it would have a traction issue. I mean, I think it would do full drop, allow the deck to settle. It's gonna do that. You just got to make sure that you don't have a chance of something binding back there when you get too close together there. Do you prefer CSI or AFCO on an IMCA sport mod? I tell you what, they're both very good shock absorbers. Each one has a little different piston combination, but they're very similar in design. I can't actually tell you that if you had equal pistons and everything equal, the shocks would probably be very equal in their ability to shock the car and do what you want it to do. It just depends on which piston you use. So I would check with my actual builder about that. I know we use a lot of different pistons, and our AFCO shocks and our CSI shocks are very similar. How does increasing or decreasing the left rear extended load affect car, 4-link modified? You want to take that, Chad?
So more extended load would be more initial load, which would make the car free in and give it traction off. So left rear load is kind of like wedge, right? The more wedge you have, the more it's going to turn into the car or turn into the corner and be freer in and tighter off. So That's basically what extended load would do.
Awesome. Jason, I know where there's a stockpile of new custom-made 12-inch 200s and 175s. Message me. Jason and I will get a hold of you tomorrow. Let's see. Right rear Wehrs 2-link brackets moving trailing arm closer to the axle tube or further away due. USRA B-Mod. Okay, right rear Wehrs 2-link bracket moving the trailing arm closer to the axle tube or further away. Well, you're changing the leverage point of it. We run our right rears, we run closer. Like on Chad's bracket, we run in the middle hole, and then our left rear, we run in the bottom hole, just because it changes the leverage. And then we try to run quite a bit more angle on the left rear trailing arm than what we do on the right rear trailing arm, and so that works pretty good. It's just anytime you get something closer to the axle housing, it's going to respond quicker, or it'll respond with more leverage if you put it further away. So in my opinion, that's what works pretty good. I agree completely. The knowledge and info that you guys are sharing is awesome. Thank you for answering all the questions. Well, I've been kind of under the weather all weekend, so I'm actually starting to weather out here. So luckily we only have 5 more minutes to go because my throat's about gone. Scott, in regards to the trend to run a softer right front spring to help the car turn, I know guys running well down into the 300s. What is the maximum spring rate that is still low enough to help turn the car? Well, a 300-pound spring is pretty soft. Wow, you'd almost have to have an awful lot of load on that to make that work. In my opinion, I don't know. I know guys are running 400s. I tend to be 400 and above. 450 kind of seems to be my normal on our GRT stuff. I like using a 450 in the right front. That seems to be a pretty good combination with a 500 left front. That seems to work pretty well. But I've never experimented with anything softer than that in what we're doing.
I got to meet Hawk Carl.
Oh, yeah, I seen that he was out there.
This guy with his trend comment here, Scott's got the trend comment, but it's almost more about what you need. It's not about what that dude over there with his roll center that's not even close to yours. I mean, so what if he's got a 300? He might have a roll center 4 inches farther to the right than you have, and he can run a 300. And if your roll center is 4 inches farther to the left, there's no possible way you're going to be able to. So
True.
You also need to just kind of go off of your own notebook and what you've been doing and stick to your plan too.
Very good point.
Carl's pretty cool.
Yeah. I've never had the pleasure of meeting him. Travis, is there a desired area on the rear end where the chain limiter should be mounted on the left rear? In my opinion, I would mount it inboard almost as far as I could. If I was to give you an actual number, probably 12 inches inboard from where the spring mounts. Would you say that's about right?
Yeah,
10 inches.
Good. Tight to the bell.
Yeah, I mean, I always slide my chain like on a quick change clear up against the bell, and I slide it on a 9-inch Ford up against the welds. Okay, don't forget, once again, I want to remind you all about our chassis schools that are coming up. January 14th and 15th is the 2-link school. February 4th and 5th is the 4-link school. February 25th and 26th is the stock car school. And March 4th and 5th is the New York school. And right now I can pretty much guarantee you that the 2-link school is going to sell out. It's got pretty big numbers already. And so we're not going to, if you're interested in that, I definitely would get registered soon because we're going to probably have to run that one down.
We got a big announcement there too. The Kevco and I, we've teamed up with Josh Ruby, and I got my big news release. Sorry, we got all messed up there.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
So we're going to start Josh and them guys did that show in Albert Lea there for a couple years, and we went and looked at a place in Rochester. So we're going to have the Midwest Motorsports Expo. It's going to move to Rochester. It'll be at the Mayo Civic Center on February 19th. It'll be a one-day expo trade show. I think we got us on board, and I think you'll be there, Bob, right?
Yep.
Got PEM and fast shafts on board, and affordable chassis, and so we're working on that. So try to keep that weekend open. It'll be a good show, more of a smaller regional show. So we're excited to get that rolling here and launch that with Kevco.
Yeah, that's an exciting deal. That show, when those guys did that before, I always thought that was a good show. We ended up, we went the first year. We didn't go the second year because it ended up being the same as one of our classes. But yeah, that's always good. Those one-day shows, in my opinion, are always a good deal.
Yeah.
You get in, get out, talk to people.
I got stocking stuff. I got a new product too. Yeah, we don't have enough time here.
That's all right.
This is our new Steve Bachman inspired and Pat Fagan approved axle cap U-joint cap keepers. So instead of using the old duct tape when you change the drive shaft, this guy just pops over to keep your caps on like that when you store it. So cool new product.
What does that cost, and is that on your website so people can go on there and buy that?
They are available on wehrsmachine.com. WM14, I believe they're $25 maybe. I don't have the price memorized on that one yet.
Okay, cool. Well, that would make a good stocking stuffer. Every racer needs one of them.
Yeah. We'll also be we'll be at the Chili Bowl too. That's another upcoming event for us for Wehrs Machine. We're going to set up there for the Chili Bowl Nationals with our load machines and load sticks and stagger sticks. We're going to tap into the midget market a little bit there. So I don't know when the next show that you and I are going to do here. What do you got planned there?
I was thinking January 3rd.
3rd?
Is that correct?
Yeah.
January.
Should be good for me.
So we got our stocking stuffers. I think we're good to go. I want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we'll be on board right after the New Year. So keep your questions coming, and thanks. You guys were awesome tonight, man. The questions kept rolling, and Jim already says he'll take one, so
cool.
He should be able to go on. He should be able to go on your website right now and order one of them.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, you have a good night, Chad, and have a Merry Christmas to you and your family. And we'll see you. We'll talk to you. If not before, we'll talk to you next year.
Sounds good. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.
All right. Thanks.